Welcome back to the crash course on macroeconomics. My name is Jennifer Libenga and I work with For Equality as the Economic Justice and Rights Lead, and I will be taking you through the second episode, which is on neoliberalism. So we'll be looking at everything that we need to know about Africa's crippling economies, which is linked to neoliberalism. So we often hear that Africa is resource rich and all these things, but we're also one of the poorest continents. And that begs the question, why? Why are we the way that we are? Why are we one of the poorest continents? And who is to blame and what can be done about it? This is what we'll be looking at in this episode. Yes, the content is very heavy and very complex, but I will try to simplify everything so that you can grasp the basic issues to do with neoliberalism. So let's get right into the content. So we've heard terms such as the free market or liberalization of the market environment. Most of us might have heard those. And this is basically what's at the core of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is basically an ideology or economic policy that is grounded on the belief that economies are more efficient and more effective when there is minimal or no governing body that's interfering with the market. So let the market run freely, free market. Just let it run as it's supposed to. The government should not interfere with how the market is running. That's the idea behind neoliberalism. And it also argues that state intervention is a root cause of our existing economic problems. In order to reverse the catastrophes, then individuals should be able to compete freely and access goods and services, because this will facilitate innovation and entrepreneurship, and consequently it will lead to economic growth, which sounds appealing at first glance. I mean, innovation and competition, they're good things for the economy and they do lead to economic growth. But the question is, from a feminist perspective or a gender perspective, we need to look at the competition. Is the playing field equal? Can individuals from all aspects of the economy, socioeconomic backgrounds, are they able to compete freely? And if the government is not interfering and delivering public services, who is going to be able to access these services? Can poor people access the services if the government is not providing? These are questions that we should be answering. So back to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism basically proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills. And it does this through four key pillars that we will look at. So the first pillar is privatization. And as the name implies, privatization means governments should create an enabling environment for the private sector to strive, and that states should not be responsible for delivering public services such as education, water, healthcare, housing, transportation, all the basic human rights services that you can think of. The government should not be delivering that. Instead, the government should shift that responsibility to the private sector. And essentially what that means is that as citizens, we should be paying for those services. And now we should be asking ourselves, if the government is not delivering and people have to pay, what will happen to poor people who don't have money or the capacity to access these services at a fee? The questions we should be answering. The second pillar is austerity. So we've heard of public expenditure cuts or public sector wage bill caps. We might have heard of these terms, and these are also tenets of neoliberalism. And what this pillar really proposes is that the governments should shrink their budgets as a way of being more efficient. And shrinking of the national budget means that the state's capacity to invest in public service delivery and pay public servants also shrinks, because if the budget is small, then there's not going to be much investment that's going into public service delivery, which is actually the role of the government. And this is when we see stuff like poorly furnished schools, high teacher to pupil ratios, and we also see understaffed hospitals and even public hospitals who don't have adequate supplies, We've seen all of that. That's the reality right now. And this is because of austerity, cutting down on the national budget. And the third term or tenet of neoliberalism is deregulation. Let's begin with a simple question on prices. Let's look at the price of cooking oil or the price of water, bottled water in stores. You will find that in most countries, the prices will vary. The same type of product is being sold at different prices in different stores across the country. And this is because the government is not regulating the prices. And this is a way of promoting market liberalization or neoliberalism, to say, let people put prices as they feel, and that will promote competition. But that's a problem because not everybody is also able to access those services even at that price. And another problem with that is it's causing a deterioration of the quality of the services that are being provided. And at the same time, it's become a human rights issue because the private entities almost do not care for human rights. They just care about increasing their profits. They're not really enforcing decent work principles as well because the government is not regulating. Yeah, so now that we've really looked into the tenets of neoliberalism, I think it's important for us to look at how Africa ended up implementing neoliberal policies and how they're still doing that right now. So the introduction of neoliberal policies in African states dates back to around the 1970s through the famous structural adjustment programs, which most of us have probably heard about. And these SAPs were enforced or are still being enforced by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. So SAPs are basically programs that have been designed to make economies more efficient and effective as a way of promoting economic growth. And this is basically that, yes, the different countries have probably been put into an economic crisis. If they implement the structural adjustment programs, then it will revive their failing economies, which most African countries are in a situation like that. So during the 1970s, after the global oil crisis, many countries across the globe suffered the downturn of the crisis and needed to be saved. Then came the two sister institutions, the IMF, which is an institution that's designed to provide short-term loans to countries deep in the economic crisis, and basically economies that have nowhere else to go. At that point, they have nowhere else to turn to, then they turn to the IMF to give them the short-term loan. And the sister institution, the World Bank, was basically founded to implement development and poverty reduction programs in development countries. So the IMF basically offers countries with failing economies loans to pull them out of the crisis that they're in. But there is a twist to it because the loans come with a condition. So the one condition that the IMF gives to the countries that it's giving loans to is to implement structural adjustment programs. The idea is if the countries implement the structural adjustment programs to promote economic growth, then they're in a better place to pay back the loans that they had gotten from the IMF, which basically sounds fair, right? But let's really look at what these SAPs actually call for. So, like I said, SAPs are designed to make economies more efficient and more effective. And if we look at what we had just talked about, SAPs are basically drivers of neoliberal pillars. They call for governments to back off and let the private sector deliver public services, privatization, for the government to draw back on its interference with the market, deregulation, for the government to cut back on spending, austerity, and for the government to create a conducive environment for trade liberalization. So instead of doing what they were designed to do, which is to promote economic growth, SAPs led to high unemployment rates. They increased gender inequalities because if the government is not delivering these services that they were designed to do, then the burden of delivering these services went on women and girls. So the burden of unpaid care work increased for women and girls. If we look at hospitals, back in the day, you would find that the government is giving food to the sick, but then because of SAPs, the government was no longer doing that, then women and girls were the ones that were filling up that gap. So it increased the burden on women and girls and increased the gender inequalities that were already existing. And also, because African countries continue to accumulate debt from the IMF, we're stuck in what we call a debt crisis. We keep borrowing more money from the IMF, and the more that we borrow, the more leverage we give to global institutions such as the IMF to enforce neoliberal policies. But now, looking at where we are right now and looking at how we started from the 1970s and this is like 2022, we've accumulated so much debt, and the question becomes, do we have alternatives, or are we stuck in this debt trap and can't get out of it? What really is the solution? What can we do about it? So tune into the next episode of this crash course, where we will be looking at the alternatives that we have to the problem that is existing right now.